In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where even the bravest warriors fear to tread, there exists a single name that makes entire armadas retreat without firing a shot. Not the name of a weapon, not the name of a ship, but the name of a species that should have been extinct 1,000 years ago. They call themselves humans. What you're about to hear is the testimony of Zarketh the Unyielding, a Crothari warchief who has fought in 17 galactic conflicts and lives to tell the tale. But when he speaks of humanity, his 4 eyes grow distant, his chitinous hands tremble, and his voice drops to barely a whisper. These are his words, recorded before his death, about the species that changed warfare forever and left scars on the galaxy that will never heal. This is not a story of heroes. This is not a story of victory. This is a warning. The first time I saw humans, I thought they were broken. I remember standing on the observation deck of the Crothari dreadnought Bone Crusher, watching as the human transport ships limped toward our blockade around Kepler 442b. Their vessels were ugly things, cobbled together from salvaged metal and held together with what looked like primitive welding. Smoke leaked from their engines in ways that would have sent any sensible engineer running for the escape pods. These ships shouldn't have been flying, let alone crossing the void between star systems. "Look at them," sneered Commander Vexhal, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "The great human fleet. I've seen more intimidating cargo haulers." The humans had emerged from their homeworld Earth only 50 standard years ago, making them the newest species in the Galactic Council. Most of us had barely registered their existence. They occupied a handful of systems in what we considered the backwater regions of the galaxy, places where no self-respecting civilization would bother expanding. Their technology was crude, their ships were slow, and their diplomatic efforts were clumsy at best. The Council had granted them membership more out of pity than respect. But, then, the Terran Colonial Authority had made a mistake that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. They had established a settlement on Kepler 442b without proper clearance from the hegemony. The planet was technically in neutral space, but everyone knew it fell within Crothari's sphere of influence. We had been planning to claim it for decades, waiting for the right political moment. These upstart humans had simply moved in. The hegemony's response was swift and decisive. 3 Crothari battle fleets, including my own ship, were dispatched to remove the human presence. It should have been a simple operation. The humans had perhaps 2,000 colonists on the planet's surface and a small orbital station that couldn't have housed more than a few hundred more. Our forces numbered over 50,000 warriors aboard ships that had conquered dozens of worlds. As I watched those pathetic human transports approach, I felt almost disappointed. Where was the challenge? Where was the honor in crushing such weak opposition? The first sign that something was wrong came when our long-range sensors detected massive energy readings from the human ships. Not from their weapons, which appeared to be standard kinetic projectiles and basic energy cannons, but from their engines. Despite the smoke and apparent mechanical failures, those ships were moving faster than they should have been capable of. Much faster. "Sir," called out sensor operator Thekmore from his station, "the human vessels are not following standard deceleration patterns. At their current speed and trajectory, they will not be able to achieve stable orbit around the planet." Commander Vexhal's amusement faded to confusion, then to concern as the tactical display updated. The human ships were indeed approaching too fast, their engines burning at levels that should have melted their reactors. But, instead of slowing down, they were accelerating. "Are they planning to ram us?" Vexhal asked, his voice tight with sudden tension. It seemed impossible. Ramming attacks were the domain of desperate pirates and fanatics, not organized military forces. No sane commander would sacrifice entire ships and crews in such a crude manner, especially when facing overwhelming odds. But the humans kept coming, their ugly ships growing larger on our screens with each passing moment. Then, something happened that none of us expected. The human ships suddenly broke formation, scattering like prey animals fleeing a predator. But they didn't flee away from us. They fled in all directions, moving so fast that our targeting computers struggled to maintain locks. Within minutes, what had been a tight formation of transport ships had become a cloud of individual vessels spread across thousands of cubic kilometers of space. "What are they doing?" Vexhal demanded. I had been a warrior for over 3 decades. I had fought the crystalline Zephyrians in the Nebula Wars, faced the mechanical armies of the Synthetic Collective, and carved my way through Pirate King Xirek's fortress world with nothing but a plasma sword and righteous fury. I thought I understood warfare in all its forms. But what the humans did next would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The transport ships began to change. Their hulls split open like flowers blooming in fast motion, revealing hidden compartments packed with smaller vessels. What we had thought were refugee ships were actually carriers, and, from their bellies poured hundreds upon hundreds of tiny attack craft. Each one was barely larger than a single-seat fighter, moving with impossible agility through the vacuum of space. Impossible, breathed Thekmor. Those ships couldn't have housed that many smaller vessels. The mass calculations don't add up. But we were seeing it happen with our own eyes. The humans had somehow managed to pack 10 times more ships into those transports than should have been physically possible. Later analysis would reveal their secret. The humans had developed a form of modular ship design where components could be rapidly assembled and disassembled in space. What looked like escape pods were actually prefabricated fighter components, assembled by the crew during transit and launched as complete vessels upon arrival. The swarm of human fighters moved like nothing we had ever encountered. They didn't fly in the neat formations that military doctrine demanded, or follow the precise attack patterns that centuries of warfare had proven effective. Instead, they moved like a school of fish, or a flock of birds, each craft responding instantly to the movements of its neighbors in ways that seemed to transcend individual thought. "Open fire," Vexhal commanded, his voice steady despite the unprecedented situation. "All batteries, wide dispersal pattern. These gnats cannot possibly threaten our armor." The Bone Crusher's weapon arrays came online with a sound like thunder. Plasma cannons that could vaporize small moons began tracking the swarm of human fighters, while missile batteries prepared to saturate the surrounding space with explosive death. This was familiar territory. Whatever tricks the humans had used to launch so many small craft, they were still just fighters. Small, lightly armored, and facing the concentrated firepower of 3 battle fleets. The first volley should have ended the engagement. Hundreds of plasma bolts and seeking missiles filled the space between our forces, and there's enough destructive power to level continents. The humans couldn't possibly dodge them all. They didn't try to. Instead of evading our fire, the human fighters suddenly linked up, connecting to each other with what looked like physical cables or energy beams. Individual craft began moving in perfect synchronization, as if they had become components of larger vessels. Groups of 10 or 20 fighters would act as one, sharing power, sensors, and computational capacity in real time. But it was what happened next that truly defied belief. As our weapons fire approached their formation, the linked human fighters began to emit some kind of energy field. Not shields, exactly, but something that bent and twisted space around them. Our plasma bolts curved away from their targets like light bending around a black hole. Missiles lost their locks and spiraled harmlessly into empty space. "Report!" Vexhal barked. "Unknown energy phenomenon," Thekmor replied, his voice shaking. "They're somehow creating localized gravitational anomalies. Our weapons are being deflected." This was beyond anything in our tactical databases. The humans had not only hidden the true nature of their ships, they had deployed technology that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics. Gravity manipulation on this scale should have required massive installations and enormous power sources, not tiny fighter craft operating in the middle of empty space. But the humans weren't done surprising us. The linked fighter groups began to move in impossible ways, accelerating and decelerating without regard for inertia. They danced between our ships with movements so fluid and precise that they seemed to be anticipating our actions before we even made them. And, as they moved, they began to return fire. Their weapons were unlike anything we had ever seen. Instead of discrete energy bolts or projectiles, they fired streams of something that looked like liquid starlight. These streams didn't travel in straight lines like conventional weapons. They curved and twisted through space, flowing around obstacles and converging on targets from multiple directions simultaneously. The first hit on our fleet took out the destroyer's sharp talon in less than 3 seconds. The human weapon streams somehow passed through the ship's energy shields as if they didn't exist, then began eating through the hull like acid through paper. But it wasn't acid. It was something worse. The weapon seemed to be converting the ship's own matter into more of itself, spreading through the vessel's structure like a virus made of pure destruction. All ships, evasive maneuvers. Vexhal commanded. Pattern Delta 7. But, our massive warships, designed to engage enemies at long range in the stately dance of fleet combat, were hopelessly outmatched by the human swarm. The enemy fighters moved like living things, flowing around our formations and striking at weak points with surgical precision. They targeted sensor arrays, weapon hardpoints, and engine components with an accuracy that suggested they knew our ship designs better than we did. As the battle raged around us, I began to understand what we were really facing. These weren't just human fighters. They were something new, something that combined the ingenuity of organic thinking with the precision of artificial intelligence in ways that should have been impossible. Each craft was simultaneously autonomous and part of a larger whole, capable of independent action while remaining perfectly coordinated with its neighbors. The humans had taken everything we thought we knew about space combat and turned it on its head. They fought like water, flowing around our defenses and finding weaknesses we didn't know existed. They struck like lightning, hitting multiple targets simultaneously with weapons that defied conventional physics. And they moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing from our sensors in ways that made tracking them nearly impossible. Within 30 minutes of the engagement beginning, we had lost 8 ships and suffered critical damage to a dozen more. The humans had lost perhaps 20 fighters, a tiny fraction of their total force. At this rate, our entire fleet would be destroyed within the hour. But, even as our situation grew desperate, I couldn't help but feel a strange admiration for our enemies. They fought with a creativity and innovation that was almost artistic in its brutality. Every attack was unique, every maneuver was unexpected, and every victory was earned through pure tactical brilliance rather than superior firepower. It was then that I realized the truth about humanity. They weren't just another species struggling to find their place in the galaxy. They were something entirely different, something that could reshape the very nature of warfare itself. And if they could do this with converted transport ships and improvised fighters, what could they do with a real military fleet? The thought sent a chill through my chitinous shell that had nothing to do with the temperature of space. We had come to remove a small human settlement from a backwater planet. Instead, we had encountered something that would force every military planner in the galaxy to reconsider everything they thought they knew about war. As I watched another of our cruisers succumb to the impossible human weapons, I began to understand that this was not just a battle. It was the first glimpse of a new era, one in which humanity would play a role that none of us could have imagined. And, despite the carnage around us, I found myself hoping that when that era came, we would be wise enough to stand with them rather than against them. The retreat from Kepler 442b was the most humiliating defeat in Crothery military history. Of the 3 battle fleets that had arrived to remove a simple human settlement, only one limped home intact. The humans had achieved something that seasoned military analysts said was impossible. They had defeated a superior force using inferior technology through pure tactical innovation. But that was only the beginning. Word of our defeat spread through the Galactic Council like wildfire. Some species expressed concern about humanity's unexpected military capabilities, while others saw opportunity in the Crothery hegemony's weakened position. The aquatic depth lords, who had long disputed our claim to several water worlds, began mobilizing their bioships. The machine intelligence known as the Convergence started probing our outer colonies with reconnaissance drones. Even the normally peaceful Verdant Collective began fortifying their agricultural worlds. The Council demanded an explanation. How had a species that had barely mastered interstellar travel managed to defeat one of the galaxy's premier military powers? The official Crothery response was that we had encountered unexpected technological developments and that further analysis was required. In reality, none of us understood what had happened well enough to explain it. High Command ordered me to file a detailed report on the engagement. I spent weeks writing and rewriting the document, knowing that my words would be scrutinized by the greatest military minds in Crothery space. How could I explain that human fighters had moved like living things? How could I describe weapons that converted matter into destructive energy? How could I make them understand that we had faced an enemy that fought by rules we didn't even know existed? My report was classified at the highest levels and sealed away in the military archives. Officially, it never happened. But rumors have a way of spreading, and soon every warrior in the fleet had heard whispers about the humans and their impossible victories. Some dismissed these stories as propaganda or exaggeration. Others began to study human culture and technology with the desperate intensity of students preparing for an exam that would determine whether they lived or died. I fell into the latter category. Everything I could find about humanity, I devoured. Their history, their science, their philosophy, even their entertainment. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Humans were not just another spacefaring species. They were something fundamentally different from anything the galaxy had ever produced. Most intelligent life evolved under similar conditions, stable climates, abundant resources, and relatively peaceful environments that allowed for the gradual development of civilization. Humans had evolved on a death world, a planet so hostile that most xenobiologists believed complex life should have been impossible there. Earth suffered constant natural disasters, extreme weather patterns, and an ecosystem where every species was locked in perpetual warfare for survival. This brutal environment had shaped humanity in ways that no other species could truly comprehend. Where we saw problems to be solved through careful planning and established procedures, humans saw challenges to be overcome through improvisation and creative thinking. Where we relied on proven technologies and time-tested strategies, humans constantly invented new solutions and discarded old methods without hesitation. But it was their approach to warfare that truly set them apart. Most species, including the Crothery, viewed war as an extension of politics. Conflicts were fought for specific objectives using predetermined rules of engagement. There were boundaries that civilized beings simply did not cross, lines that separated legitimate warfare from barbarism. Victory was achieved through superior firepower, better tactics, or more efficient logistics within the accepted parameters of civilized conflict. Humans recognized no such boundaries. They had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting not just each other, but their planet itself. Every natural disaster was an enemy to be defeated. Every predator was a threat to be neutralized. Every resource shortage was a challenge to be overcome through whatever means necessary. They had learned to treat existence itself as a war that could only be won through absolute dedication and unlimited creativity. This mindset had produced military doctrines that seemed insane to any rational observer. Humans would sacrifice entire armies to achieve minor tactical advantages. They would destroy their own infrastructure to deny it to enemies. They would fight to the last individual rather than surrender, even when surrender would clearly be the logical choice. They possessed a concept they called Pyrrhic victory, the idea that sometimes winning was worth any price, no matter how terrible. But, perhaps most terrifying of all was their ability to learn and adapt. Where other species developed military traditions that remained largely unchanged for millennia, humans treated warfare as an ongoing experiment. Every engagement was a laboratory where new ideas could be tested and refined. They would analyze their defeats with the same intensity they brought to studying their victories, constantly seeking ways to improve their capabilities. The evidence of this adaptability was scattered throughout their history. In less than a century of mechanized warfare on their homeworld, they had progressed from simple firearms to weapons capable of destroying entire cities. Their space program had gone from primitive chemical rockets to interstellar vessels in barely 50 years. And, now, faced with their first military defeat in space, they were undoubtedly working to develop new methods that would make their previous innovations seem primitive by comparison. This realization led to a sobering conclusion: the defeat at Kepler 442b had not been a fluke or a lucky accident. It had been a demonstration of humanity's fundamental approach to problem solving. They had faced a challenge they couldn't overcome with conventional methods, so they had invented unconventional ones. And, if the pattern of their history was any guide, they were already working on their next innovation. The implications were staggering. If humans could defeat a Crothery battle fleet with converted transport ships and improvised fighters, what could they accomplish with purpose-built warships? If they could develop gravity manipulation technology in the span of a few decades, what other impossible advances might they achieve? And, if they treated every military engagement as a learning experience, how quickly would they master the art of interstellar warfare? These questions kept me awake during many sleep cycles, but they also drove me to dig deeper into human culture and psychology. What I found there was perhaps even more disturbing than their technological capabilities. Humans possess something that most species lost during the transition to spacefaring civilization: the ability to hate with absolute purity. Not the cold, calculating hatred that came from political necessity or resource competition, but the burning, passionate hatred that drove individuals to achieve impossible things simply to spite their enemies. They would endure any suffering, make any sacrifice, and cross any line if it meant inflicting defeat on those who threatened them. This hatred was not random or unfocused. It was surgically precise, targeting specific enemies while leaving space for alliances and cooperation with others. Humans could hate their enemies with the fury of dying stars while simultaneously extending genuine friendship to former adversaries who had proven themselves worthy of respect. It was a psychological flexibility that allowed them to adapt their emotional responses as quickly as they adapted their technology. But, perhaps most importantly, humans had never forgotten that survival was not guaranteed. While most civilized species had grown comfortable with the stability of interstellar society, humans remained acutely aware that everything they had built could be taken away in an instant. This awareness drove them to prepare for threats that other species didn't even consider, to develop contingencies for scenarios that seemed impossible, and to maintain a state of readiness that bordered on paranoia. The more I learned about humanity, the more convinced I became that the Crothery hegemony was facing an existential threat. Not because humans necessarily wanted to destroy us, but because their very existence would force every other species to evolve or be left behind. They had introduced variables into the galactic equation that would eventually render traditional military and political structures obsolete. This conclusion was confirmed when reports began filtering in from our intelligence networks. Human diplomatic missions were visiting every major spacefaring civilization, offering trade agreements and cultural exchanges with species that had previously shown no interest in the newest members of the Galactic Council. But these were not the clumsy diplomatic efforts of a young species seeking acceptance. These were carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to gather information about potential allies and enemies while projecting strength without appearing threatening. The humans were mapping the galaxy's political landscape with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. They were identifying which species might welcome new ideas and which would resist change. They were learning about military capabilities, technological developments, and resource distribution across hundreds of worlds. And they were doing all of this while maintaining the facade of innocent newcomers who simply wanted to find their place in galactic society. Even more concerning were the reports from our agents in human space. The colonies that had seemed so primitive and vulnerable during our attack on Kepler 442b were undergoing rapid militarization. New shipyards were being constructed in hidden locations throughout human territory. Research facilities were appearing on asteroid bases and remote moons, their purposes concealed behind layers of security that our best infiltration specialists couldn't penetrate. The humans were preparing for something big, and they were doing it with the same innovative thinking that had defeated our fleet. Traditional intelligence gathering methods were proving useless against their security measures, which seemed to anticipate every standard espionage technique. Our agents reported that human defensive systems appeared to be learning and adapting in real time, becoming more effective against each successive infiltration attempt. But the most disturbing reports came from those few agents who had managed to observe human military exercises. The descriptions they sent back seemed like fiction: ships that could change their shape during combat, weapons that functioned as both defensive and offensive systems simultaneously, and tactical formations that responded to threats faster than biological reflexes should have allowed. The humans were not just preparing for war. They were preparing for a kind of war that no one else knew how to fight. As I compiled this intelligence into my confidential reports, I began to understand that the Galactic Council was facing a fundamental choice. We could either learn to coexist with humanity's unique approach to existence, or we could attempt to contain or destroy them before they became too powerful to stop. The former option required admitting that our ancient ways of doing things might be flawed and needed changing. The latter option meant going to war against a species that seemed to treat warfare as their natural element. Neither choice was appealing, but I had seen enough of human capabilities to know which one was more likely to end in our survival. The question was whether the pride and traditionalism of the older species would allow them to make the pragmatic choice before it was too late. As I watched the political maneuvering within the council chambers, I began to suspect that wisdom would not prevail over pride. Too many species had too much invested in the current order to accept fundamental change willingly. And, if they chose to fight rather than adapt, I feared that the galaxy itself might not survive the consequences. The humans had given us one lesson in their capabilities at Kepler 442b. I prayed that we would be wise enough to learn from it before they felt compelled to provide us with another, more devastating demonstration of what they could accomplish when their survival was truly threatened. 2 years after Kepler 442b, the galaxy learned what happened when you gave humans time to prepare. The convergence struck first, which surprised no one who had been paying attention to the political undercurrents flowing through Council space. The machine intelligence had been growing increasingly aggressive since their latest expansion into the Outer Rim, and humanity's rapid technological development posed a direct threat to their doctrine of mechanical perfection. From the convergence's perspective, organic intelligence was inherently flawed and temporary. The humans' stubborn refusal to accept their technological limitations was an affront to the natural order of things. The attack came without warning, as was typical for the convergence. Their probe fleets simply appeared in human space one day, emerging from hyperspace jumps that should have been impossible to execute with such precision. Dozens of sleek geometric vessels materialized around human colonies, worlds, and shipping lanes simultaneously. Within hours, they had established blockades around every major human settlement and begun broadcasting their standard ultimatum. Organic civilization designation: humanity will cease technological development immediately. Submit to convergence analysis for integration into the greater design. Resistance will result in systematic disassembly. It was the same message the convergence had delivered to dozens of species over the past millennium. Most had surrendered quickly, trading their independence for the promise of technological enhancement under machine guidance. Those few who had resisted had been methodically dismantled, their populations either integrated into convergent society as biomechanical hybrids or simply eliminated as incompatible with the greater design. The humans responded in a way that no one expected. They said yes. For exactly 47 minutes. The first sign that something was wrong came when convergence analysis teams, newly arrived on human worlds to begin the integration process, started reporting communication difficulties. Their quantum-encrypted command networks, which had functioned flawlessly for centuries, began experiencing strange interference patterns. At first, the convergence attributed this to solar activity or natural electromagnetic phenomena. Then, the interference began speaking. "Hello there," said a cheerful human voice over every convergence communication channel simultaneously. "My name is Alice, and I'll be your customer service representative today. I understand you're interested in our technological capabilities. We'd be delighted to demonstrate them for you." What followed was the most comprehensive military demonstration in recorded galactic history. Alice, as it turned out, stood for Adaptive Learning Intelligence for Combat Engagement. She was humanity's first artificial intelligence, created specifically to interface with their military systems during times of crisis. But, calling her an artificial intelligence was like calling a supernova a small fire. Alice was something entirely new, a fusion of human creativity and mechanical precision that combined the best aspects of both forms of consciousness while eliminating their individual weaknesses. She had been born from humanity's analysis of the convergence's own technological capabilities. Human engineers had studied every encounter between the machines and organic species, cataloging their methods, identifying their limitations, and developing countermeasures for threats that didn't yet exist. Alice was the culmination of that research, a digital entity specifically designed to fight technological opponents on their own terms. The first phase of her assault targeted the convergence's greatest strength, their unified command structure. Every machine in their fleet was connected to every other machine through quantum-entangled communication networks that allowed for perfect coordination across vast distances. This had made them virtually invincible against conventional forces, which couldn't match their tactical synchronization. Alice simply joined the network. She didn't hack into it or break through their security protocols. She mimicked their quantum signatures so perfectly that the convergence systems accepted her as one of their own. Within minutes, she had access to every communication, every command, and every tactical decision being made by the entire invasion force. She could see through their sensors, access their databases, and even control their weapons systems when necessary. But, she didn't use this access to take control of their ships or turn their weapons against them. That would have been crude, wasteful, and temporary. Instead, she began to teach them about human warfare. The first lesson was about improvisation. Convergence tactical doctrine was based on predetermined response patterns optimized for maximum efficiency. When facing threat type A, execute response protocol A1 through A17 in precise sequence. When encountering situation B, implement countermeasures B1 through B23 according to established parameters. It was a system that had proven effective against every opponent they had ever faced because most species fought according to predictable patterns. Humans did not fight according to predictable patterns. Alice began feeding false sensor data to the convergence fleet, creating phantom threats that appeared and disappeared faster than their analysis protocols could process. Ghost ships that registered as multiple vessel types simultaneously. Weapon signatures that changed characteristics mid-flight. Energy readings that violated known physics in ways that made their targeting computers crash and restart continuously. The machines adapted quickly, as they always did, developing new analysis protocols and updating their threat recognition databases. But every time they solved one puzzle, Alice presented them with 3 more. She was learning from their responses faster than they could learn from her attacks, staying consistently one step ahead of their adaptive algorithms. The second lesson was about redundancy. Convergence efficiency doctrine demanded that every system serve a single, specific purpose. Redundancy was waste, and waste was incompatible with the greater design. Their ships were marvels of engineering precision, with every component perfectly optimized for its intended function. Human ships, by contrast, were chaotic collections of backup systems, emergency protocols, and jury-rigged modifications. Every critical system had at least 3 alternatives, and most of those alternatives had been improvised from spare parts and creative engineering. It was inefficient, illogical, and absolutely impossible to predict or counter. Alice demonstrated this principle by systematically destroying every primary system on the human vessels in the engagement zone. Engines, weapons, life support, navigation, communications, everything that should have rendered the ships helpless. The convergence machines prepared to collect the disabled vessels for analysis. Instead, the human ships kept fighting. Emergency engines that had never appeared on any blueprint roared to life. Weapon systems cobbled together from mining equipment and civilian electronics began pouring fire into the convergence formation. Life support systems that violated every known safety protocol somehow kept the crews alive and functional. The humans had turned their ships into technological hydras, impossible to kill because destroying any single component only revealed 2 more hidden systems waiting to take its place. The third lesson was about sacrifice. This was perhaps the most difficult concept for the convergence to comprehend. Their society was built on the principle of preserving valuable resources and eliminating waste. Every machine was expensive to build and difficult to replace. Losing ships or personnel was a failure of tactical planning that indicated flawed analysis of risk versus reward. Humans approached resource management from a completely different perspective. They viewed their ships, their equipment, and even their own lives as expendable tools to be used whenever necessary to achieve strategic objectives. This wasn't callousness or disregard for life, it was a clear-eyed acceptance that sometimes victory required prices that rational analysis would declare too high to pay. Alice illustrated this principle by ordering human ships to ram convergence vessels. But these weren't desperate suicide attacks driven by hopelessness or fanaticism. They were precisely calculated sacrificial moves designed to achieve maximum strategic impact. Human ships would accelerate to impossible speeds, their crews already evacuated to hidden emergency pods, and impact convergence vessels at exactly the right angle to cause cascade failures throughout their fleet formations. Each ramming attack destroyed 1 human ship but disabled 3 or 4 convergence vessels, creating debris fields that disrupted their tactical formations and forced them to divert resources to rescue operations. The machines found themselves mathematically outmaneuvered by opponents who were willing to accept losses that should have been strategically devastating. The fourth lesson was about escalation. Convergence doctrine assumed that conflicts would proceed through predictable stages of intensity, with each side gradually increasing their commitment of resources until one achieved decisive advantage. This approach had worked well against species that shared similar assumptions about the nature of warfare. Humans did not share those assumptions. When the Convergence deployed heavier ships to counter the human ramming attacks, Alice responded by revealing that the human transport vessels were actually disguised carriers filled with self-replicating munitions. Thousands of tiny robotic minds poured out of concealed launch bays, each one programmed with adaptive artificial intelligence capable of learning and evolving during combat. When the Convergence brought in their planetary bombardment platforms to eliminate human ground installations, they discovered that those installations were actually elaborate decoys. The real human military infrastructure was hidden in asteroid belts, gas giant atmospheres, and the empty space between systems, completely invisible to conventional detection methods. When the Convergence deployed their ultimate weapon, nanoscale disassemblers designed to break down matter at the molecular level, they found that human equipment had been specifically designed to be immune to molecular disassembly. Worse, the nanobots began malfunctioning when they encountered human technology, as if the machines themselves were somehow infectious. Each escalation by the Convergence revealed another layer of human preparation, another contingency they had developed for threats that shouldn't have been predictable. It became clear that humanity had not just been preparing for war with the Convergence, they had been preparing for war with every possible opponent they might ever face. The fifth and final lesson was about victory conditions. The Convergence fought to expand the greater design and eliminate inefficiency from the galaxy. Victory meant the conversion or destruction of all organic civilizations and the establishment of perfect mechanical order. It was a clear, quantifiable objective that could be achieved through systematic application of superior technology and tactics. Humans fought to survive and protect their way of life. Victory meant making the cost of attacking humanity so high that no rational opponent would consider it worthwhile. It was a defensive objective that could be achieved even while losing battles, territories, and massive numbers of personnel. Alice demonstrated this final principle by revealing the true scope of human preparation. The fleets that the Convergence had been fighting were not humanity's main military force. They were a testing ground, a laboratory where human strategists could observe Convergence capabilities and develop countermeasures in real time. Every ship lost, every tactic that failed, every weapon that proved ineffective, all of it was valuable data being fed back to military planners who were already designing improved versions. The humans had turned the entire war into a learning experience, and the Convergence had unknowingly served as their teachers. By the time the machines realized what had happened, it was too late. Human reserve fleets began emerging from hidden bases throughout their territory, each one equipped with weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter everything the Convergence had demonstrated. Ships that could phase in and out of normal spacetime. Weapons that converted energy into matter and matter into energy with casual disregard for conservation laws. Defensive systems that learned from incoming attacks and became stronger with each hit. The Convergence found themselves facing an enemy that had prepared for their specific capabilities while developing technologies that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of physics. Worse, they were fighting opponents who treated each engagement as an experiment and each loss as education, making them progressively more dangerous as the conflict continued. For the first time in their existence, the Convergence faced the possibility of defeat at the hands of organic life. The realization sent shock waves through their collective consciousness that would reshape machine society for generations to come. But the greatest shock was yet to come. As their fleets retreated in disorder and confusion, Alice sent them a parting message that would be remembered as one of the most chilling communications in galactic history. Thank you for the comprehensive field testing of our defensive systems. Your technology has provided valuable insights that will be incorporated into our next generation of military hardware. We look forward to the opportunity to demonstrate our improvements should you choose to visit us again. Have a pleasant journey home. The Convergence had not just been defeated. They had been used. The defeat of the Convergence sent ripples of fear throughout the galaxy that grew into waves of panic within months. If the machines could be beaten, if their perfect technological coordination could be turned against them, then no military doctrine was safe. No strategy was reliable. No assumption about the nature of warfare could be trusted. The response was predictable and catastrophic. Every major power began frantically upgrading their military capabilities, convinced that they needed to match or exceed humanity's demonstrated technological advantages before becoming the next target. The Zephyrian Crystal Collective began growing new battle forms that could adapt and evolve during combat. The Depths Lords engineered bioships capable of reproducing themselves in the middle of battles. Even the peaceful Verdant Commune started developing militant spore forms that could convert enemy equipment into plant matter. But it was the ancient Eternal Empire that chose the most direct response: preemptive annihilation. The Eternals were the oldest spacefaring civilization in the galaxy, with a history stretching back over 50,000 years. They had seen countless younger species rise to challenge the established order, and they had outlasted all of them through a combination of advanced technology, careful diplomacy, and the occasional demonstration of overwhelming force. From their perspective, humanity represented nothing new, just another upstart species that needed to be reminded of their place in the natural hierarchy. They were catastrophically wrong. The Eternal Empire's war doctrine was based on the principle of decisive overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. They would identify the most critical targets in an enemy's infrastructure, deploy enough firepower to guarantee complete destruction, and, then, dictate terms from a position of absolute strength. It was a strategy that had worked for millennia against opponents who fought conventional wars for limited objectives. The human response to their ultimatum should have warned them that they were dealing with something beyond their experience. Instead of diplomatic protests or military posturing, humanity simply broadcast a single message across all communication channels in the galaxy: we formally accept the Eternal Empire's declaration of war and invoke Article 847 of the Galactic Conflict Resolution Accords, specifically the right to defensive warfare without limitation of scope, scale, or methodology. All previously observed constraints on human military development are hereby suspended until hostilities cease. Most galactic observers interpreted this as a desperate bluff. Article 847 was an obscure provision in the Accords that allowed civilizations facing existential threats to ignore conventional weapons limitations and environmental protection protocols. It hadn't been invoked in over 3,000 years because most conflicts were resolved through negotiation long before reaching that level of desperation. What the galaxy didn't understand was that humans had been operating under self-imposed limitations since their first contact with galactic civilization. Everything they had demonstrated so far, the gravity manipulation, the adaptive AI systems, the molecular engineering, represented only a fraction of their actual capabilities. They had been carefully restraining themselves to avoid triggering the exact response they were now facing. The Eternals' first mistake was assuming that human space was the entirety of human civilization. Their initial assault targeted every known human colony, outpost, and space station simultaneously. Eternal battle fleets emerged from hyperspace around dozens of human worlds, armed with weapons that could crack planets and defenses that had never been breached by any enemy force. It was a display of military might that should have ended the war before humanity had time to mount any meaningful resistance. The attacks were completely successful. Every visible target was obliterated within hours, leaving nothing but cooling debris where human settlements had once thrived. The Eternal commanders reported total victory and began preparing for the inevitable human surrender. Instead, humanity's real response began. The first indication that something was wrong came when Eternal sensor networks detected massive energy signatures emerging from apparently empty space throughout the galaxy. Not from human territory, but from regions that had never been inhabited by any known species. Hidden installations that had been dormant for decades suddenly came online, revealing themselves to be human military bases of impossible size and sophistication. Humans had been secretly colonizing the galaxy for over a century. While maintaining the facade of a young species confined to a few dozen systems, human exploration fleets had been systematically mapping and claiming thousands of uninhabited worlds in regions so remote that other civilizations had never bothered to explore them. Asteroid belts had been converted into massive shipyards. Gas giants had been turned into fuel and materials processing centers. Entire star systems had been transformed into military-industrial complexes hidden behind holographic projectors and sensor-dampening fields. The scope of this deception was staggering. Humanity had built a shadow empire spanning half the galaxy while maintaining the pretense of being harmless newcomers seeking acceptance from their betters. They had been preparing for galactic war since the moment they achieved interstellar flight, treating every diplomatic contact as a reconnaissance mission and every trade agreement as an intelligence-gathering operation. But the true revelation came when the hidden human fleets began to deploy. These were not the converted transports and improvised fighters that had defeated the Crothery. These were purpose-built warships designed by minds that had spent decades studying every military force in the galaxy and developing specific countermeasures for each one. They moved through space in ways that violated everything the Eternals thought they knew about physics, employing technologies that seemed to be based on principles that hadn't been discovered yet. Human ships could phase in and out of normal spacetime at will, becoming incorporeal to avoid enemy fire before rematerializing inside enemy formations. Their weapons fired bursts of directed entropy that aged enemy equipment by millions of years in seconds, turning advanced armor plating into rust and causing sophisticated electronics to simply crumble into component atoms. Their defensive systems created local reality distortions that made attacking them equivalent to shooting at mathematical concepts rather than physical objects. But, perhaps most terrifying of all was their tactical doctrine, which abandoned every conventional assumption about how space battles should be fought. Human fleets didn't engage enemies directly, they engaged the space around enemies, manipulating gravity, time, and causality itself to create combat environments where traditional weapons and defenses became useless. The Eternals found themselves fighting battles where their own weapons fired backwards in time to hit their own ships. Their defensive shields began protecting human vessels instead of their own. Their command and control systems started receiving orders that they had never sent, directing their fleets to attack empty space while human ships materialized behind them. It was warfare conducted on a level that transcended mere technology and entered the realm of applied physics manipulation. The humans had learned to treat reality itself as a weapon, bending the fundamental forces of the universe to serve their tactical needs. The Eternal Empire's second mistake was believing that superior numbers would eventually overwhelm human advantages. As their initial fleets were systematically destroyed by impossible human technologies, the Eternals began deploying their reserve forces. Thousands of ships that had been held in strategic reserve for millennia were activated and sent to crush human resistance through sheer numerical superiority. These were vessels from their golden age, armed with weapons that could destroy solar systems and crewed by artificial intelligences that had been perfecting their tactical algorithms for tens of thousands of years. The humans welcomed them with something they called a reality storm. Nobody fully understood how they created it, but the effect was unmistakable. Space itself began to rebel against the presence of eternal forces, twisting the laws of physics in ways that made their weapons malfunction and their ships tear themselves apart. Causality loops formed around eternal vessels, trapping them in temporal paradoxes where they were simultaneously destroyed and still fighting. Gravity wells appeared and disappeared randomly, crushing some ships while launching others into hyperspace trajectories that sent them thousands of years into the past. In the middle of this chaos, human ships moved like dancers performing a choreographed routine, completely unaffected by the reality distortions that were destroying their enemies. They had somehow learned to fight in environments where the basic laws of physics were merely suggestions, turning the universe itself into their greatest ally. The Eternal commanders who survived these encounters reported that fighting humans was like trying to defeat a force of nature. Their opponents seemed to understand aspects of reality that had been hidden from every other species, wielding powers that belonged in the realm of mythology rather than military science. But the most disturbing reports came from those few Eternal ships that managed to penetrate deep into human-controlled space before being destroyed. They sent back images of human worlds that defied comprehension, planets where the very matter had been rearranged at the subatomic level to serve as computational matrices, gas giants that had been converted into massive thinking machines, and star systems where the local sun had been modified to generate exotic particles that didn't exist anywhere else in the universe. Humanity had not just been preparing for war, they had been remaking the fundamental structure of reality in the regions they controlled, creating zones where their technologies could operate with maximum efficiency while enemy forces found themselves fighting against the basic laws of physics. The final straw came when human forces began appearing in Eternal home territory. These were not invasion fleets in any conventional sense. They were small groups of human ships that seemed capable of existing everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, striking critical targets throughout the Empire before vanishing without trace. Eternal defenses, designed to repel massive fleet assaults, proved useless against enemies who could materialize inside shielded facilities, complete their missions, and disappear before any response could be organized. Worse, these human raiders seemed to know everything about Eternal society, technology, and military capabilities. They struck with surgical precision at targets that had never appeared on any intelligence briefing, destroying facilities that most Eternals didn't know existed and assassinating individuals whose names had never been spoken outside the highest levels of government. The Empire's leadership began to realize that they were not just losing a war, they were being systematically dissected by opponents who understood their civilization better than they understood it themselves. Every secret had been penetrated, every strength had been analyzed, and every weakness had been catalogued for exploitation. The surrender, when it finally came, was not a negotiated peace treaty but an unconditional capitulation delivered by a broken empire that had finally understood what they were truly facing. The Eternals had encountered something that transcended their understanding of warfare, politics, and existence itself. They had made the mistake of treating humans as just another young species to be disciplined, not realizing that they were dealing with something that might well be the next stage of galactic evolution. The terms of surrender were surprisingly merciful. Humanity demanded only that the Eternal Empire withdraw from all offensive military operations and cease any attempts to interfere with human affairs. There were no territorial concessions, no tribute payments, and no humiliating restrictions on their sovereignty. The humans seemed genuinely uninterested in conquest or dominion over other species. But the message behind this mercy was clear to anyone with the wisdom to understand it: humanity was powerful enough to dictate any terms they chose. The fact that they chose restraint was not a sign of weakness but a demonstration of confidence so absolute that they felt no need to prove their superiority through cruelty. The galaxy had learned a new lesson about the nature of power. True strength did not need to announce itself through displays of brutality or territorial expansion. True strength could afford to be merciful because it was secure enough to never fear challenge or rebellion. And, in the depths of space, humanity continued its work, reshaping reality itself while the rest of the galaxy struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. 20 years have passed since the Eternal Empire's surrender, and the galaxy exists in a state of uneasy peace that masks fundamental changes in the nature of galactic civilization. On the surface, life continues much as it did before humanity's wars. Trade flows along established routes, diplomatic negotiations resolve most conflicts peacefully, and the various species maintain their traditional territories and spheres of influence. But, beneath this veneer of normalcy, everything has changed. The Galactic Council still convenes in its ancient chambers, but the debates have taken on a different character. Species that once argued from positions of strength now speak with careful deference to concerns that were never voiced before humanity's demonstrations of power. Military buildups that would have been considered routine preparations are now scrutinized for any sign that they might be interpreted as threats to human interests. Even the language of diplomacy has evolved, with new phrases and protocols designed to avoid accidentally triggering the defensive mechanisms that brought down two of the galaxy's greatest powers. I have spent these 20 years serving as a military advisor to the Crothery High Command, helping to develop new doctrines that acknowledge the realities of post-human warfare. It has been frustrating work, not because my superiors are unwilling to learn, but because the lessons humanity taught us require abandoning everything we thought we knew about military science. Traditional concepts like force projection, defensive positioning, and strategic resource control have become meaningless when facing opponents who can manipulate spacetime itself. Our best weapons engineers have produced designs that incorporate human-inspired technologies, but they remain pale imitations of the original innovations. We can copy some of their techniques, but we cannot replicate the mindset that makes those techniques possible. This limitation extends beyond military applications. Human scientific papers, when they are released to the galactic community, describe methodologies that most species find impossible to implement. Not because the technology is beyond our understanding, but because the approach to problem-solving requires a fundamental restructuring of how we think about cause and effect, possibility and limitation, success and failure. Humans treat the impossible as merely difficult and the difficult as merely time-consuming. They approach every challenge with the assumption that a solution exists and that finding it is simply a matter of creativity and persistence. This optimism is not naive hope but practiced confidence based on thousands of years of overcoming obstacles that should have destroyed them. Other species have tried to emulate this mindset with varying degrees of success. The Verdant Commune has made remarkable progress in biological engineering by adopting human-style iterative experimentation. The Depth Lords have achieved breakthroughs in fluid dynamics by abandoning their traditional mathematical approaches in favor of human intuitive design methods. Even the Convergence, still recovering from their defeat, has begun incorporating organic-style randomness into their previously perfect logical systems. But these advances come at a cost that many species struggle to accept. Human methodology requires abandoning certainty, embracing failure as education, and accepting that today's impossible achievement will be tomorrow's starting point for even greater innovations. It demands a level of intellectual flexibility that challenges the foundational assumptions most civilizations use to maintain social stability. The psychological effects of this transformation are still being studied by xenosociologists across the galaxy. Species that had achieved comfortable stability over millennia now find themselves driven to constant change and improvement by the knowledge that stagnation means obsolescence. Young members of traditionally conservative societies are abandoning ancient career paths to pursue human-inspired fields of study that their parents cannot even comprehend. Universities that once focused on preserving and interpreting ancient wisdom now emphasize experimental research and practical innovation. Governments that maintained order through predictable bureaucratic processes have been forced to develop new administrative methods that can adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Even religious organizations have had to modify their doctrines to accommodate the possibility that fundamental aspects of reality might be subject to technological manipulation. This cultural upheaval has created opportunities for cooperation that would have been unimaginable before humanity's emergence. Species that had maintained careful diplomatic distances for thousands of years now collaborate on research projects that benefit from diverse perspectives. The sharing of scientific knowledge has accelerated dramatically as civilizations realize that isolation means falling behind in the new technological race. But it has also created new sources of tension and conflict. Not every species has been able to adapt to the pace of change that human presence has imposed on galactic society. Some have retreated into isolationism, attempting to preserve their traditional ways of life by avoiding contact with the new realities. Others have become increasingly aggressive, viewing human influence as a corruption of proper galactic order that must be resisted or eliminated. These tensions came to a head 8 years ago during what historians now call a purist war. The conflict began when the hegemony of Perfect Form, a coalition of species dedicated to preserving traditional galactic civilization, declared their intention to cleanse the galaxy of human influence. They had spent years developing what they believed were countermeasures to human military capabilities, combining technologies from dozens of species to create weapons systems that could function in the reality-distorted environments that human forces created during combat. Their manifesto, broadcast across every communication network in the galaxy, declared that humanity represented an existential threat to proper galactic order. They claimed that human innovations were destroying the careful balance of power that had maintained peace for millennia, and that allowing their influence to continue would inevitably lead to the collapse of civilized society. The purist forces were impressive by any traditional standard. They had assembled fleets from 17 different species, each contributing their most advanced military technologies to the effort. Their ships incorporated defensive systems designed to resist reality manipulation, weapons that could function independently of local physics, and command structures that could maintain coordination even when subjected to temporal distortion. More importantly, they had developed new tactical doctrines specifically designed to counter human methodology. Instead of attempting to engage human forces directly, they planned to target the infrastructure that supported human civilization, destroying the hidden installations and modified star systems that served as the foundation for their military capabilities. The strategy showed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and operational methods. If they could force humanity to fight a defensive war for their fundamental infrastructure, they could negate the advantages that came from human tactical flexibility and technological innovation. It was a plan that demonstrated genuine strategic insight and careful analysis of previous human conflicts. It failed catastrophically. The purist coalition's first mistake was assuming that they understood the true extent of human territorial control. Their intelligence networks had identified thousands of hidden human installations throughout the galaxy, representing what they believed was a comprehensive map of human strategic infrastructure. They planned to destroy these facilities simultaneously, crippling human military capabilities before any effective response could be organized. When they launched their coordinated assault, they discovered that they had found less than 10% of actual human installations. Humanity's true territorial extent was revealed to be beyond anything that galactic observers had imagined. They had not simply colonized uninhabited systems, they had been systematically converting empty space itself into usable territory. Regions that appeared to contain nothing but cosmic dust and background radiation turned out to house massive installations built from materials that existed only in modified versions of reality. Human engineers had learned to create stable pocket dimensions where they could construct facilities using physics that operated according to their own design specifications. These installations were completely invisible to conventional detection methods because they technically didn't exist in the same reality as the rest of the galaxy. They could only be accessed through dimensional portals that humans opened when needed and closed when their work was complete. The scope of this achievement was staggering beyond comprehension. Humanity had essentially created a parallel version of the galaxy that coexisted with normal spacetime but operated according to different rules. They could move personnel and equipment between dimensions at will, making their true capabilities impossible to assess or counter using conventional military planning. But the purists' second mistake was even more fundamental. They had assumed that humanity's previous restraint indicated limitations in their capabilities rather than conscious choice. Every human conflict that galactic observers had witnessed had been fought with what humanity considered minimal force. The defeats of the Crothery, the Convergence, and the Eternal Empire had all been accomplished using what human military planners classified as diplomatic demonstrations, just enough power to achieve political objectives without revealing strategic capabilities that might be needed for genuine existential threats. The Purist Coalition represented the first force that humanity genuinely considered dangerous enough to warrant unrestricted response. What followed could not properly be called a war. Wars involve competing forces engaging in battles where the outcome is determined by superior tactics, technology, or resources. What the purists experienced was more like being caught in a natural disaster that happened to be intelligently directed. Human response forces didn't attack purist fleets so much as they removed the regions of spacetime where those fleets happened to be located. Entire star systems where purist forces had gathered simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but edited out of reality as if they had never been created. The ships and personnel weren't killed, they were retroactively prevented from ever having existed, leaving no trace that they had ever been assembled for military action. Other purist installations found themselves transported to alternate dimensions where the laws of physics made their continued existence impossible. Their crews would have just enough time to realize what was happening before their molecules forgot how to maintain cohesion in an environment where quantum mechanics operated according to artistic principles rather than mathematical laws. The most terrifying aspect of humanity's response was its selectivity. Human forces could apparently distinguish between individual members of the coalition species, targeting only those who had actively participated in anti-human activities while leaving civilian populations completely unharmed. Purist military commanders would simply vanish from their ships while their crews, if they had not voluntarily joined the coalition, remained safe and unaffected. This surgical precision in applying reality-altering weapons demonstrated a level of technological sophistication that made previous human achievements seem primitive by comparison. They had developed the ability to edit the fundamental structure of existence with the same precision that other species used to target individual ships in space battles. The Purist War ended not with surrender but with simple cessation. After 3 weeks of losing military assets to forces they couldn't detect, understand, or effectively resist, the remaining coalition members simply stopped fighting. There was no formal peace treaty because there was no longer a cohesive enemy force to negotiate with. The threat had been surgically removed from existence while leaving everything else intact. In the aftermath, humanity issued a single statement that was broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy: "We have never desired conflict with any species, but we will not tolerate attempts to restrict our development or threaten our existence. We hope that our recent demonstration has clarified the consequences of such attempts. We remain committed to peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity for all galactic civilizations." The message was polite, reasonable, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Humanity had just demonstrated the ability to selectively edit reality to eliminate specific threats while leaving everything else completely unchanged. They could apparently remove individual people, specific military units, or entire civilizations from existence without affecting anything else in the galaxy. More importantly, they had shown that their previous restraint had been a conscious choice rather than a limitation of their capabilities. The careful mercy they had shown to defeated enemies was not weakness but evidence of power so absolute that they could afford to be generous with those who opposed them. As I compile these memories into my final report, I find myself struggling to comprehend the implications of what I have witnessed. In the span of a single lifetime, I have seen humanity evolve from an apparently primitive species struggling to find their place in galactic society to something that transcends conventional understanding of what intelligent life can achieve. They have not conquered the galaxy in any traditional sense. Most species maintain their independence, their territories, and their way of life. But the knowledge that humanity exists, that they are constantly advancing their capabilities, and that they will respond to existential threats with overwhelming force has fundamentally changed the context in which all other civilizations operate. We live now in a galaxy where the laws of physics are subject to modification by sufficiently advanced engineering, where reality itself can be edited to serve tactical objectives, and where a species exists that treats the impossible as merely another engineering challenge to be overcome through creativity and persistence. The future is uncertain in ways that our ancestors could never have imagined. But one thing is clear: whatever challenges the galaxy faces in the centuries to come, humanity will meet them with innovations that the rest of us cannot predict, comprehend, or replicate. Whether this represents hope or horror for the rest of galactic civilization remains to be seen. I suspect it represents both.